Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's private EndNote 20 Essentials class for NOAA. Thanks for joining me. I'm excited to highlight fundamental features and workflows available in EndNote 20 for you today and point out enhancements and improvements added in this new version for anyone with experience using EndNote X9 or earlier. And as Katie mentioned, as we proceed through the presentation, feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we'll be spending the end of our session answering as many of those inquiries as possible, but I'll be sure to provide offline responses afterward if we run out of time. Just a quick introduction. My name is Jimmy McCollery, Digital Education Specialist here at Clarivate. I work from the San Francisco Bay Area, and I've been with the EndNote team for quite some time now, celebrating my 21st work anniversary last July. I started in the customer support department back in 2000, helping process orders and assist with various order-related questions and issues. I joined the technical support team in August 2001, where I spent most of my tenure supporting EndNote and several other programs over the years. I jumped at an opportunity to join Clarivate's digital education team mid-2018, and now primarily focus on developing EndNote training materials, but I also lead EndNote training sessions for both public and private audiences like this session today. And I feel honored to have assisted so many researchers in preparing their projects for publication. I believe there's no field of study too small to impact our global society positively. Now, I've prepared a custom 60-minute lesson plan for us today. And before we begin, let's go over the primary learning objectives that we'll be covering during today's lesson. We'll be starting from square one by creating an EndNote library, which is essentially your database of references and research literature and materials that you want to keep track of. I want to talk a little bit about the structure of an EndNote library. Typically, each library consists of two components, an ENL file and a data folder. And there are a couple of locations where you don't want to store a library while you're actively developing it. And I'll be sure to point out those locations when we get started. I'd like to show you how you could manually create a reference if the need were to arise, something that might not come up for you very often, but there are certain types of literature or sources that you just might not be able to capture electronically from a web browser. So always good to know how to the process to manually add a reference to your library. And we'll talk a little bit about the ability to import consistently tagged text files as well. A lot of information providers will allow for an export option to save tagged data to send to various applications. And today we'll talk a little bit about that process and that text format. I'll show you the most common automated reference capturing workflow called direct export next. That's a sort of a piece of technology that an information provider can add to their website so that after you've queried their databases, the information provider can prepare the selected references and again another consistently tagged text file, but this time around with direct export, that file is opened automatically by EndNote, and EndNote knows which filter to apply. So it's almost direct export is almost like the manual text file import, but it's triggered automatically and you don't have to select a filter. It's a lot more seamless in that regard. Once you start adding materials to your EndNote library, we recommend adding an extra level of organization to that library by creating what we call group sets, which are sort of, you can almost think of as folders in your EndNote library. And within the group sets, you can create what we call library groups. There are three types of groups you can create with EndNote Desktop. Today, we'll be focusing on what we call custom groups, which is the type of EndNote library group you manually populate. Next, I'll talk a little bit about EndNote's file attachment capabilities. I'll show you how you can manually attach almost any type of file to an EndNote library. EndNote also has a feature built into it called Find Full Text that allows the application to go out onto the internet to try to find full text articles for you. So if in your discovery process, you're perhaps not coming across PDFs and saving those yourself, EndNote can try to do that heavy lift of locating those resources on the web and just adding those to your library automatically. If you are coming across PDFs yourself and you're saving those to your hard drive, you can import individual PDF files or an entire folder of PDFs into EndNote 20, and so long as EndNote's able to find the DOI number for those articles, EndNote can auto-populate a new reference in your library for that particular piece of literature and attach the PDF at the same time. So find full text can save a lot of time as well. And the PDF import, it really just depends on sort of how you're approaching your discovery phase or discovery process with regard to, how you're building your library. EndNote itself has a built-in PDF viewer. So if you attach a file that happens to be a PDF, you don't even have to leave the application to view that PDF. That built-in PDF viewer also has annotation capabilities. So you can do things like highlight text, strike out text, you can underline text, and you can add searchable sticky notes where you maybe add a little, note or a phrase for yourself or a library sharing team member. And all of these annotations, if you choose to set up a library sharing team, will synchronize among all of the team members. So sort of increase your level of collaboration in that regard. I'll show you how you can add a searchable sticky note as well. And then, once we've got some, content in our EndNote library, I'd like to show you quickly how you can sync that library with EndNote Online so that you can make your references available in the cloud or on a secondary device where you also install EndNote 20. And then once you sync your library, again, you can choose to set up a library sharing team. With the newest release of EndNote 20, your sharing team can be up to 400 sharees. And so again, I'll show you how you can set up a sharing team, describe the differences quickly between syncing and sharing. And I also want to show you if you at any point want to just share part of your EndNote library, I'll describe how you can set up a group sharing team by sharing any one of the custom groups in your synced library. And then we'll close out with a quick overview of what we call the Cite While You Write add-in for Microsoft Word. These are the EndNote tools that load into Word, which allow you to add in-text citations directly into the body of your text, and EndNote at the same time will be maintaining a formatted bibliography for you. So I'll show you a couple of methods of citation insertion. I'll show you the appropriate method for removing a citation if the need arises for you. And I'd like to quickly show you how you can customize individual in-text citations, something you would do so more often with author date citations and maybe not so much with numbered citations. And then, probably the biggest time saver of Cite While You Write is the ability to change output styles on the fly. So if you perhaps might be considering where you might be publishing a potential research project or repurposing a report for, in one format to another, you can apply style A in Microsoft Word related to Cite While You Write to conform with those formatting guidelines, and then quickly turn around and choose style B and change the format of your citations and your reference list and footnotes or endnotes if you happen to be citing references there. With that said, I've got a couple of closing slides we'll come back to at the end of our lesson, but everything else we'll be looking at today is in the application itself. And so I just want to go ahead and bring EndNote to the front of the screen here. We see that EndNote's up and running, and when you have the program open on Microsoft Windows with no EndNote library open, what we see is just sort of a transitional program window. In previous versions of EndNote Desktop, if you're familiar with EndNote X9 or earlier, this state in EndNote would just be sort of a gray screen. We found that for new users, it was causing some confusion right off the bat. So we added a little bit of context to what you're seeing and why you're seeing this particular part of the interface. And to get started with EndNote, we just either need to create a new EndNote library, open a library that we might have created in a previous session, or perhaps a library that someone sent to us via email. We could open a shared library if we're part of a sharing team, and we'll look at that in just a little bit. But today, as I mentioned, we're just going to get started from square one by creating a new blank library. We could do that by clicking the shortcut on the program window here to create a new library, but both of these commands are also found on the File drop-down menu. So here on File, we can select New as well. I think I'll go and choose the menu item today. And when you create an EndNote library, which again is essentially your database of references, EndNote just wants you to choose a location for the library and assign a name to the file. Now, as I mentioned, there are a couple of places where you don't want to store a library that you're actively developing. That would be on a network drive. Network drives are fine for backups of your EndNote library, but while you're in the process of adding references or making changes to your library, you really want that to reside on a local hard drive. And in addition to that, you don't want to store a library that you're actively developing within a local sync folder. That means Dropbox, Google Drive, OneDrive. Those locations are all fine for backups of your EndNote library. But again, if you're in the process of making changes and developing your library, you don't want to store that library in a local sync folder. If you choose to store an active library on a network drive or a local sync folder, you run the risk of increasing your chance of encountering library corruption. And so long as you're making backups, if you're aware of that risk and if you create regular backups, I mean, you could take that approach, but it's a situation you can completely avoid so long as you save your active EndNote libraries on a local hard drive within an unsynced folder. So just as a suggestion, right here on my C drive, I've already created a library called I've created a folder called EndNote Libraries. And any libraries that I create, I'll go ahead and choose to save in this particular folder just to keep my drive organized. Now that I've chosen my location on the local hard drive, we see that the default name that EndNote suggests is my EndNote library. And that's fine, but even if you leave that default name, usually I would suggest either appending the machine type, whether it's a desktop or a laptop, or maybe your initials at the end, just to make it something unique. Now, with EndNote Desktop, you have the ability to create completely separate libraries for different projects or focus areas in your field of study. If possible, we recommend storing all of your materials in one EndNote library and using what we call groups and group sets to add that extra level of organization in the library so that you can have completely separate sets of references together and still be able to quickly find any particular reference for whatever project that you're working on. So I'm going to take that approach today. I'm going to create a library in my EndNote libraries folder called my research projects, just reflecting the fact that everything I'll be saving will be stored in this particular library. And now that I've got a location set and the library name defined, I can go and press save, and we'll see that new blank library appear on the screen here. Now, this is essentially, as I mentioned, your database of references. All of your literature will be stored in an EndNote library that you'd like to keep track of with the application. And just for me to better illustrate the various panels that comprise a library window, I want to transition over to a sample library that installs with EndNote 20. If you're following along and you've just created a new blank library, feel free to just leave this open. You don't have to go track down the sample library, but because that library has some groups, references, and file attachments in it, it'll just help me, again, better illustrate the various panels that comprise the window. So I'm going to leave this new blank library open temporarily, and I'll return to the File drop-down menu, where this time we will select Open Library instead, since we want to access a library that already exists. Now, before we go find the sample library, I just want to quickly talk about the library components that we see on screen. The Select a Reference Library window has taken us back to that same EndNote Libraries folder where we just created this new blank library, and we see there are two components associated with it. Both of the items have the name of the library, My Research Projects, but we see a file that has a .enl extension as an EndNote library, and we see a folder that has the same name with a sort of pseudo .data extension. And you can think of the analogy that the ENL file is the door to the warehouse. This is the item or the file that you would interact with if you want to open an EndNote library. The data folder, there's not really anything in there for you to interact with directly. This is really the warehouse where all of the library information is stored. And you just want to make sure that you keep both of these items together at all times. If you were to move or rename or trash your data folder by mistake, EndNote would prompt you and ask if you want to make a new copy of it, but the resulting library would not be identical. Even if you're able to make a new data folder, your library would be missing groups, recently entered references, file attachments, and your term lists would also be empty at that point. So I just really want to stress how important it is to keep both items together. I can't tell you how many times from my days of tech support where someone might have just dove in to EndNote without taking a class like this. They weren't aware of the importance of the data folder and maybe deleted it just trying to clean up their drive without realizing how important this folder is. So again, if you ever back up your library manually, be sure to include both items. If you rename your library outside of EndNote, you need to make sure that you rename both in the same manner. And again, if you're just cleaning up your drive, just be aware of the importance of that data folder. With that said, we'll go track down that sample library. So if we go navigate to the C drive here, this is a 64-bit version of Windows, which means we have 2 program files folders. We're going to go into program files x86 for the EndNote 20 program folder. We see that here. I'll open the EndNote 20 folder. In the EndNote 20 folder, we see a shortcut to examples. And if we double click on that, we see that this examples folder is a little bit buried on the drive under a public documents folder, but this location is important for shared workstations like library workstations or lab workstations. It's a folder that any user account can access so that anyone can, sort of test or try out EndNote using the tutorial items before they create a library of their own. And we see that in this examples folder, there's one library element that's different in a different format than what I just described a moment ago. As the type implies, this is an archived EndNote library, or also known as a compressed EndNote library. We see that it has an ENLX extension. And if you're familiar with zip files, it's the type of file that can contain more than one item. And this compressed format is something that EndNote can generate from you. There's a command on the file menu called compress library that'll create a compressed EndNote library for you. And this single file will store the library's ENL file and data folder. So it makes it useful for backup purposes. Instead of having to keep track of both of those items, it's just this single file that you would need to keep track of. And if you wanted to email your library to someone else, this compressed format is important because without compressing your library, that data folder is typically something you can't attach to an email uncompressed. So again, compressing your library before sharing it via email potentially is suggested so that you can ensure that you are including both of the library components. Now for me to extract this library's ENL file and data folder, I could double click on the file here, or I can single click it as I've already done, and I can choose open either way. And I think I'll go ahead and choose the open button this time around. What happens again is the ENL file and data folder get extracted to that same location, and we see that that library is now displayed on screen. We currently have 2 libraries open, and one of the enhancements in EndNote 20 for Windows is that each program window is a separate tab on your taskbar. So if you choose to create separate libraries, as I mentioned, it makes it a little bit easier to multitask. In previous versions of EndNote Desktop, you would have to use this window drop-down menu to cycle between different libraries that you have open concurrently. But in EndNote 20, we can simply, if we want to close that new blank library, we can click back on it by clicking its tab on the taskbar. And now from here, this new blank library, we can close it by clicking the X in the top right, or we can go to File and choose Close Library. We could leave these both open, but just to streamline our lesson, make sure everything is crystal clear, I am going to click Close Library. So again, we just have the new sample library open. As I mentioned, this library already has some references in it, some file attachments as well. We see some groups and group sets, so just helps me better illustrate the various panels that comprise the window. And if you are familiar with EndNote X9 or earlier, this is probably the biggest change you'll notice in EndNote 20. Our product team took a lot of focus group testing with longtime EndNote users, new users, and even non-users, researchers who might be using an EndNote alternative to help inform our design decisions. And the changes we've implemented, with the initial release of EndNote 20 were overwhelmingly endorsed. And once we released that initial build of the new version, we did get some feedback from the broader community, and we further augmented the library interface here to ensure that we've got a good platform going forward, and all sort of all of the needs are met. So even though it looks a lot different, we took a lot of time to bring EndNote up to speed in terms of design language and software design trends. We also wanted to streamline and simplify the interface. So even though it looks a lot different, the underlying concepts really still hold. The primary panel that comprises the bulk of your library window is here in the middle. It's what we call the reference list panel. This reference list panel shows you individual references, individual entries in your EndNote library, and you can have up to 10 display columns shown here. Each of the columns you can position to your personal preference in terms of size. We have a little shortcut if you want to reconfigure your display fields in EndNote 20. Just point your mouse over any one of the display columns. We see the little gear icon appear. We can left click on that. That takes us right to the display fields tab, where again we have up to 10 columns to configure. Let's say we want to store perhaps a personal filing number in the label field, which typically goes unused. We can go ahead and find label here on the fields drop down. The default heading is the same name as the field, but again, if we're repurposing this unused field to store some other information, we might want a label that better describes the information that we're storing there. So maybe we'll call this column personal filing number. We can click OK. And of course, we don't have any details in that field just yet, but now we have a display column for that. And if we want to resort these columns, we can simply drag and drop into a new position. So it really comes down to personal preference how you configure this. On the right side of the library window, we have what had been referred to as the tabs panel, but now due to a new feature, which I'll point out in just a moment, we're referring to this side panel as your reference panel. And again, even though we really tried to streamline and simplify the library interface in EndNote 20, this new summary screen is allowing us to display more vital information front and center than we've ever been able to in the past. So depending on which reference you have selected, the details will be displayed in the summary screen, and depending on its reference type, whether it's a journal, a book, or a web page, the vital details that are displayed front and center will change because each sort of type of literature or type of material have differing vital details. At the bottom of the summary screen, if you have references in your library indexed by the Web of Science, there are some shortcuts. These features aren't new to EndNote 20. These shortcuts are new though, but you can quickly, if you have access to the Web of Science, you can get back to the source article indexed by the Web of Science, or you can expand your Web of Science search to find related references. Those would be other indexed references that have at least one citation in common. At the bottom of the summary screen, we have what's called the preview panel, where you can see a preview of the selected reference and how it would format with any given output style. The default style in EndNote is called annotated. It's sort of a generic author date citation format. The reference list would include abstracts if available, a pretty uncommon requirement. So if you needed to change that, you can click the drop down here. We see our favorited output styles listed for quick selection, but if you want to choose a style that's not marked as a favorite, you can go to select another style. This choose a style window shows you all output styles available in your EndNote application. We include about 500 of the most popular styles by default, but we have at the on the downloads page at endnote.com, we have a style repository where we're hosting about 7,300 different predefined styles. So if there's a particular journal you're looking to submit a project to, or just a standard set of formatting guidelines you need to comport with for a particular project and you don't see it listed here, be sure to check the endnote.com/downloads page. That's where you'll find all of our content file repositories, and there's a good chance your styles are available to download, and you can incorporate that in your EndNote installation. Just as a quick example, I'll type a couple of letters here to jump to, let's say, the JAMA style in EndNote, and I can now either double click on its name or single click and press choose either way. But we see that preview updates dynamically. And this is a great way to spot potential data entry issues before you begin to start citing in a research project. If you noticed a typo, or maybe you pasted in a straight carriage return, if you were manually creating a reference, you would be able to spot that here quickly. And if you did notice an issue, or you just wanted to look at the remaining or underlying details for that particular reference, you can go to the edit screen. This is where all of the, again, dozens of fields for each reference type are found. And not only can you read and review what's already present, but you can make changes here. You can add, missing information. You can fix a typo. You can delete a piece of information if you have something that you might not want to store in your library reference for whatever reason. You can take that out, and all of the changes can be saved here. Initially removed in the first release of EndNote 20, we have now added this back in one of the iterative updates for EndNote 20. This is the PDF preview screen. So if you have a PDF attachment linked to a library reference, and this little paperclip icon in the reference list panel signifies a file attachment. But if your attachment is a PDF, you can review that right on the PDF preview screen. The idea behind its removal initially is for a typical computer, let's say laptop screen sizes. I think I'm on a 13-inch monitor. It's pretty hard to read, an article from this PDF preview screen, even if you zoom in. But we did get some feedback from the broader community after the initial EndNote 20 release, letting us know that, some people are using very large monitors or perhaps even televisions these days for their computer monitors, and they're able to read that text with no issue. So we did restore that again with EndNote 20. And I did want to just show you quickly, this is being hidden by the GoToWebinar toolbar, but if I just pull my application window over for a moment, you can, from the PDF preview screen, pop a PDF out into what we call the standalone viewer. This standalone viewer was written from the ground up by our developers in EndNote 20 and has already resulted in a more responsive reading experience. But from here, you can increase the size even further, and you can add annotations as we see here, which we're going to do in just a little bit. I'm going to go and just close this here quickly. Back on the library window, if we look on the left, we see what we call the groups panel, where we find default groups such as all references. As the name implies, this heading shows you every single reference stored in a particular EndNote library. Recently added, if we right click on that, will show us references added in the last 24 hours by default, but you can toggle that to the last 7 days, 14 days, or 30 days. I'll talk about tabs in just a moment. We see that unfiled currently only has one reference in it right now. The name unfiled sounds a bit ominous if you don't know the purpose of this group, but this is almost, you can think of as your library's inbox. And if you want a very organized library where each reference is filed away in a group for a particular project, unfiled is just a quick way to let you know if you've missed any. So currently 189 of the 190 references in this library are associated with at least one custom group. We can right click on unfiled, and we can ask EndNote to consider whether or not the reference is in a smart group instead. And I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But right now we're just asking EndNote to determine whether or not a reference is in a custom group. This is the only reference that's not. And again, if we wanted to organize our library, all we'd have to do is simply drag and drop any unfiled reference into what we call a custom group in EndNote, and we would see that reference becomes filed away. So that's, again, a quick way to ensure that you've got an organized library, and if you've missed any references in terms of the organization, unfiled lets you know about that. Trash, as the name implies, is just a holding space for references you choose to delete. You can always restore something from the trash. We have a shortcut for that. You can, at any point as well, if you know these items will be references you never wish to recover, you can empty the trash if you choose to do so, and those references will be permanently deleted from your library. And in this example library, we see sample group sets, these overarching labels for different projects or focus areas in the field of study. These can be collapsed individually as well. In these example group sets, we see all three types of library groups that you can create. Again, today we're, due to time constraints, just focusing on custom groups. Those are represented by the little inbox icon here. Custom groups are the types of groups you manually populate. As you noticed when I dragged the unfiled reference into the Corvids group, we saw that it's count grew by one reference. So custom groups are the most common type of library group. We have smart groups, like I was mentioning. Those are represented by the little magnifying glass. These items you don't manually populate. If we edit this existing smart group by right-clicking on it and then left clicking edit group, we can see that when you create a smart group, there's a search linked to it. And EndNote, anytime you add a new reference or edit an existing reference, EndNote will perform that smart group search automatically to determine whether or not that reference should be part of that smart group. So in this case here, EndNote is just to show you once more, EndNote is looking in any field of any of the items listed under all references to determine whether or not any of the fields contains the term sonar. And again, I wouldn't be able to change the count of this smart group in any other way other than modifying the associated search to either broaden or narrow the scope of the search. The last type of group, again, we won't be discussing today. Smart groups and combination groups we focus on in the advanced level lesson plan, but we have as well what are called combination groups. They're represented by this little overlapping inbox icon. It's another element that you can't manually populate. If we edit this combination group, we see that it has a search link to it as well. But instead of defining a term or a phrase to look for, combination groups are used to compare or contrast the contents of two or more groups to determine how they differ or how they overlap. So in this case here, this echolocation or sonar combination group, we're asking EndNote show us any references in sonar or echolocation. So sort of determining, references that exist in either one in this particular state. We have another combination group in this sample library called corvids and parrots. If we edit that, we see that that one is asking EndNote to show us any references that are in both the corvids group and the parrots group. This is probably the less used group structure, but very powerful. Again, if you're looking to determine how your groups differ or how they overlap. You can completely collapse your group structure here in EndNote 20. And I just did want to quickly point out that the groups panel does share some screen real estate with the find full text search outcome. Shared groups via EndNote Online, shortcuts to the shared groups will show here as well. You'll see that in just a moment. And if you wanted to connect to a remote database directly in EndNote using a feature we called online search, you can do that as well here from the groups panel. That's something we won't be discussing today either, but I did want to point that out. You can resize the groups panel here if you want. You can, if I just resize the library window once more, you can close the reference panel if you maybe want to dedicate a little more screen real estate to your reference list panel, but you can double click at any point and the reference panel reappears on demand. And then the final portion or panel I wanted to touch on before we start building in this library is the search panel at the very top. In EndNote X9 and earlier, we had a concept called quick search, which was just a quick way to look for a term or a phrase in any field in the displayed references. That functionality is still present. It's just now called simple search, and it's been repositioned on the same panel as what we call advanced search. So if we want to search our entire library, all 190 references for, let's just say, the term bird, we can type that into the simple search field, press enter on our keyboard. All right, so we see the search is already initiated. We see that EndNote is highlighting where in the library within the display fields where that term is found. So we see we have one reference in which we've got an author whose surname is Bird. We're seeing Bird is being found in the title field for some of the other references. So again, a quick way to look for a term or a phrase regardless of field. But if you did want to target a search on a particular field or craft a multi-parameter search, that's when you would toggle to advanced search here. We see we have 3 parameter fields by default. We don't have to populate all 3. We could just populate one if we want. If we want, we can add up to 10 parameter fields by clicking the plus symbol. And again, you can define up to 10 parameters per advanced search. We see the various list of fields available to search by in our EndNote library. We'll go ahead and just leave that set to author for now. The contains default for this dropdown is really the most, I'd say, or the broadest option. It's just, determining whether a particular term or phrase exists within a larger field perhaps. But if you want to craft a very precise search and you want to find an exact match, you can choose is. If you want to look for a number range or a letter range, we have options for is less than, is less than or equal to, is greater than or equal to. If you want to generally sort of discover how a field begins or ends, you have options for that. And maybe you've got shared keywords that share the same root, and you want to make sure you find all variants of that keyword, you have an option for word begins with. I'm going to just leave this set to is due to time constraints, and we'll just search for that term bird again. Now that we're limiting our search just on the author field, if we press search, we should just oh, excuse me, I need to set this back to contains. That was the trouble. So if we go and press search here, perfect. We see that in this particular reference, we've got that author whose surname is Bird, and it wasn't found because Bird wasn't the exact field. There's other information in that field as well. So I do apologize for that mistake. Now that we've really toured the library interface in EndNote 20, let's look how you can add a reference manually if the need were to arise. You could always go to the references drop-down menu, select new reference here. We can also just right from the library toolbar, click this little plus symbol icon. This will add a new reference to the selected group as well. If we go and click the shortcut today, we have a new reference window. It's sort of a blank slate for a new entry in our library. And when you're adding a reference, and this is something I would probably say you would encounter most if you're looking to cite a standalone web page, since most web pages don't have EndNote export options. But I recommend setting your reference type first. We've got dozens of predefined reference types. You can even create your own. But I recommend setting this first because if you keep an eye on the field names to the left of this dropdown, as soon as I, let's say, click newspaper article, we see that instead of author, we have reporter. Instead of a journal field, we have newspaper. So a little bit more appropriate for this type of material. And when you're entering names within your library, whether they're author names, editor names, reporter names, you could enter names in a format of either first name space last name, or you can use the last name comma first name, and it would recognize either format. And we want to make sure that we enter one name per line in these fields. That's how EndNote tells where one name ends and the next name begins. Now these terms are in red because EndNote is letting us know in this library it's the first time these terms are found. So if we knew we had another reference from John Smith, that might let us know we have a typo, or perhaps we're using a different naming convention for that person. And if we enter the same name in different formats, that can throw off EndNote's ability to consistently output that person's name in a formatted bibliography or in your formatted citations. And you don't have to populate every single field. At the very least, you would want to populate the fields you wish to include in a formatted bibliography. And you can always come back to this window, if you've got maybe scant details to start with and you want to just get a placeholder for that reference, you can always come back and make further changes from that edit screen. This is enough, again, just for our example here. So I can go and just press save to save these changes. I can either close the reference window by clicking the X or by going to File, Close Reference, either way. We're back on the library. Now we see we have one unfiled reference again because this new reference we just added is not yet part of a custom group. And if we wanted to keep our library organized, even though this is a placeholder, we can simply drag and drop into any custom group represented by the inbox icon. And we see that that reference is now filed away. So again, manually adding references might not come up very often, but nice to know how to do it. The more common method of automated reference creation, as I was mentioning, is what we call direct export. The process to initiate an export can vary from site to site. I don't have access to many subscription databases myself, but I wanted to show you a couple of examples, if possible. I wanted to show one example export from the new Web of Science, just to show you how the process might typically, you might invoke that process typically, and then we'll look at an example from PubMed.gov in terms of exporting. But here in the new Web of Science, we've got a list of fields to search by. Topic is the default selection. We see their topic will query title, abstract, author keywords, and keywords plus all at once. And let's say we're going to be starting on a project pertaining to the topic of asthma. We can search on that. Maybe if we want to narrow our results, we can add a second row. We've got our Boolean operators, which are sometimes referred to as field connectors. You might have noticed this in EndNote as well. It's just a sort of an element related to a complex search to let the service or the program know how to link two or more parameters together, depending if you want to narrow or broaden the scope of your search. And let's say we want to limit our search to the last decade. So we can choose year published there. We can define a date range. We can do 2012 to 2022, press search on this. Right away, the Web of Science comes back to let us know that in this instance, almost 98,000 references are indexed in the Web of Science core collection that fit the scope of this search. We have some additional filtering options here if we wanted to, but the new Web of Science allows us to export up to 1,000 references to EndNote at a time. If we wanted specific search results, after reviewing them in the list of results, we could mark those references and just those items would be sent to EndNote. But again, if we don't mark any from the Web of Science, we can export up to 1,000 references per export. Let's not mark any. Maybe we'll ask for 50 references here. With no references selected, we can choose export. We'll select EndNote Desktop as our destination. And we see that because we hadn't marked any references, we can define a range of up to 1,000 at a time. And let's just say we want the second batch of 50. We can ask for references 51 through 100. Certain information providers give you control over the record content that gets sent to EndNote. And because we queried the Web of Science core collection, we can ask for author, title, source, and abstract. But if we choose full record, we'll also get the author's address and the keywords for each reference. So a little bit more of a complete entry in our library. Now, if we press export, we see that what happens is the information provider prepares a temporary internet file that needs to be opened by EndNote to complete the export. Now, I'm using Mozilla Firefox, which has built-in file type associations, which makes it a little bit easier to manage. But this is something you can also do from Google Chrome or Internet Explorer, although you might have to rely on the Windows file type associations. And as I mentioned, normally you want to open this file with EndNote to complete the export, but I'm actually going to bypass that. I'm going to halt the export for a moment by saving this file instead, because I just want to give you a sneak peek of what it looks like behind the scenes. So if we go to downloads, this is where the new temporary file was downloaded to. I could open this with any text editor, but I have an application called Notepad++ I'll use. And we see that in this text file, even though it's got a custom extension, it's really just a text file. We see all of the data is on its own line with an identifying tag in front of it. So this is data that we could manually import as well. If an information provider didn't have direct export, but they let you save references in a tagged format, you can manually invoke this in EndNote. But the time saver for direct export is that EndNote will receive this file. This first line tells EndNote where the data is coming from and which filter to apply to it. And then when you're importing data, EndNote's not reading the reference information. It's looking for the identifying tags in front of each piece of data. Those tags are defined in your import filter, and each tag has a linked field so that EndNote knows where that resulting data should end up. So in this case here, when you're importing from the Web of Science, each time EndNote sees AU space, EndNote expects author information and will put that data into the author field. Just scrolling down, anytime EndNote sees TI space, EndNote knows that's title information, that'll go into title. SO is the sort of the source line info, that data will go into the journal field. And so regardless of the source, really the same thing's happening behind the scenes. And essentially that's how EndNote is capturing this data. It's not reading the reference information, it's looking for those identifying tags. Now, if you use, like I mentioned, Chrome or Edge, this file might get saved initially. You might then have to use Windows to go to properties, where you would, under the Open With association, you would either want to select Research Soft Direct Export Helper or just the EndNote application. You can choose either one, and that will proceed with the export. So even though this file got saved, we can, now that it's been saved, since Windows know how to handle the file, we can just double click on it. It comes right into our library because then again, EndNote knew which filter to apply. We see a new temporary group called imported references has been created. And we see that we have 50 unfiled references as well, because again, these are not yet part of a custom group. And as I was describing, while you're building your library, adding references, that's really the best time to group them. That way, you know, if you search for topic A, only those references would be unfiled, make it a little bit easier than if you search for topic A, didn't file away your references, and then you search for topic B. At that point, you would have both sets of references intermingled in unfiled. It wouldn't make it impossible to group them, but at that point, it definitely adds an extra level of complexity that wouldn't exist otherwise. So let's make a new group set for this project, this asthma-related project we're getting started with. We can go to the groups drop-down menu. We can select create group set about halfway down. We see a new group set with a placeholder name. We can delete that. Any naming convention is fine, but something pertaining to the project usually makes the most sense. And now that we've got that defined, we can hit enter. That group set name exists. We can now create a custom group for any purpose for us. But let's say we're going to cast a wide net in our discovery phase, and we want to, file all of this literature away for review in this group. From the groups dropdown, we can choose create group. We have our new custom group with a placeholder name. Any naming convention is fine, but something related to its purpose usually makes the most sense. We'll call it asthma in general. Press enter here. Now that that group's been created, we'll see that we could now go to unfiled, click on any one of the references so that they're highlighted. Go ahead and press Control A, or you can go to Edit, Select All, either way. That'll highlight all of the references in unfiled. And now we can simply drag and drop right into this new group that we created. And we see that those references are filed away there. So just quickly, I know we're running a little bit short on time here already, but just to show you quickly, if we go to pubmed.gov to show you how the export process can vary, we're just going to do a quick search here. PubMed.gov actually allows you to export up to 10,000 references at a time. But again, if you want specific references, let's say, you would just mark those and only those references would be sent. If you don't mark any, you can ask for a range of up to 10,000, as I mentioned. Let's just capture these 3 in this example here. We can proceed by clicking send to. We'll choose citation manager, click on create file. And again, it's a different type of file extension, but it's just another tagged text file that needs to be opened by EndNote to complete our export. And I'm just going to make sure that this opens with EndNote 20. Perfect. Now, if we click OK, EndNote will come to the front of the screen. We see those 3 references in our library. They're also considered unfiled. We can select those, drag them right over into our new custom group, and our library is all organized. So that process can vary from service to service, how you would export. You can always reach out to your local library at NOAA. You can reach out to EndNote product support. We can try to help demystify the process or figure out if there is a direct export workflow. You could typically also perform a web search. If you Google, direct export, EndNote, and then the name of an information provider, you can usually find instructions there as well. But now we've got some references in our EndNote library. Let's start talking about some file attachment capabilities here. Each reference in your library can store up to 45 attachments, although most users are just attaching a single full text PDF. So let's just, as an example, let's click on any one of our references here. A couple of ways you can do this, but I'd say the most straightforward method is just to press attach file. This would take you to a browse window asking you to choose the file to link. In downloads, I know I have an example PDF that I'll go ahead and link to here. And in in downloads, we'll just select that PDF. We'll choose open. EndNote's going to copy the file from downloads and put the version that EndNote accesses within my library's data folder. We now see a little PDF icon under summary. If we move on to another reference, we'll save our change by clicking yes. We now see we have the paperclip icon signifying a file attachment. It doesn't mean it's a PDF. It could be a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet. If you attach a non-PDF like a Word document, you have to have that application on your machine to open that file. But if it is a PDF, as I described earlier, you can go to the PDF preview screen where you can review the PDF itself. But again, if you wanted to open this in a more full screen state, you can click this little icon here on the PDF screen tab. We see that that opens the standalone viewer in EndNote where we can zoom in, make that a little bit bigger. If we click on this icon on the toolbar, this is the markup or annotation tools. We can do things like highlight text if we'd like. We can underline text, strike that text out. We can add this little button here, click that button to add a sticky note. And if we double click on the sticky note, this is just a free text field where we can type a phrase to ourselves or a note to ourselves or a colleague. And like I mentioned, these are searchable down the road, and you can sync these with library sharing team members. If we close this and then close the PDF, we can save our change. All right, and we see that that's now in our EndNote library. So again, each entry in your library can store up to 45 attachments. If you're not coming across PDFs yourself and you want EndNote to go out onto the web for you to try to find what it can, you can select one reference at a time for your searches or a batch of references, up to 250 per batch. I'm just going to highlight the 28 references in this parrots group just due to time constraints. And if we want to initiate our search, we can click on the icon here, this little shortcut, the little magnifying glass. This will initiate a find full text search. We see if we scroll down a bit on the in the groups panel, that find full text heading, as I was describing, is showing us the outcome of the search. There are 3 possible outcomes from a find full text search. So long as you're seeing the searching heading, that means the search is still taking place. And I'd say the most straightforward outcome of find full text is that it finds a PDF to download for you, and if it does, it's going to just attach that to the associated reference. And again, I'm relying on open access publications. So if you have subscription access, your success rate might be a bit better. But out of the 28, the search just finished, EndNote was able to find 10 PDFs for us. Just save those to the references, and we can see those are accessible in the library. For 15 of the PDFs, nothing was found, of course, as it implies here, and we don't see anything for these references. But for 3, a PDF wasn't found, but EndNote was able to find a URL and added that to the reference. And usually that's going to take us to the publisher's website, where we might be able to possibly purchase or rent the article, perhaps. But I would always reach out to your local librarian before purchasing any article, because you might have access to it through some other system or service. So find full text is a great time saver, but if you are coming across PDFs, you can go ahead and in EndNote, go to the file menu. You could import these by going to the import dropdown, choose folder if you want to import a folder of PDFs. We can press choose here to select the folder that we want to import. I know that under downloads, I've got a folder called project articles with a couple of subfolders. And if I choose that overarching folder name, click OK, I can ask EndNote to look at the PDFs in the subfolders and create a group set for us. So once we choose import, we see that EndNote's already creating the group set in our groups panel. And for each PDF, I believe I have 9. EndNote's looking at the first 2 pages of text and the metadata for each file to try to find the article's DOI number. And if that is found, EndNote will query a partner database called crossref.org to try to find that metadata for the reference. And so long as Crossref indexes that reference, and it will receive a fully populated entry and will have the PDF attached. So that just finished as I was speaking. We have our group set, project articles. For 9 of the PDFs, 5 imported successfully. We see fully populated references and the PDF attached. But I do have a couple where we just have placeholder references. These are examples of PDFs where EndNote couldn't find a DOI number. And when that occurs, again, EndNote will still create a reference and attach the PDF, but you just have the title of the PDF in the title field and the metadata is not present. And if you want, you can repurpose these placeholders by adding missing information, or you can delete the placeholder reference and try to add it through a different process like direct export. Now to quickly show you, I know we're running real short on time, and I'm probably going to have to provide after session follow-up answers to any follow-up questions. But just to quickly show you, once you start developing a primary library, at any point you can sync it with EndNote Online. You go to the library drop-down menu here in EndNote 20, choose sync. If you have not yet made a free EndNote Online account, you can do so at this time. But if you have an existing account, you can simply define those login credentials here. All right. I'm just typing in my credentials. Hopefully I get them correct. All right. Perfect. The first time you sync, EndNote recommends backing up your library. A good idea to do so. Just due to our limited time, I'm going to go and say no here. And the sync is a two-way street. So anything in your desktop library will go up to EndNote Online and vice versa. If there was anything already in the online library, that'll come down to EndNote Desktop. At this point, you would be able to, from any browser, be able to visit the EndNote Online login page. There's a link on the EndNote homepage here. where you can log in to your web library using those same credentials. And again, you would be able to access your synced library information from pretty much any device that has an active internet connection. Once that sync takes place, you could, like I mentioned, install EndNote on a second computer where you load the EndNote application as well. You would make a new blank library on any secondary computer just by clicking File, New. And as soon as that blank library exists, when you go to perform your initial sync from the library dropdown, everything will copy down from your primary library so that that second library mirrors the first computer. And then going forward, anytime you make a change, once every 15 minutes, EndNote checks to see if it needs to send or receive any information. Now, once you sync, you could share individual custom groups in your library. If you right-click a custom group, you would have an option to share the group, as I mentioned. And here you would just define the email address for a colleague who also has EndNote online. If I want to share this with my colleague Tom, I can go and do that here. And Tom would be able to then access that this group from his EndNote online account. And each sharee can be given a varying level of access rights. So maybe I'll give him read-only access. Once he's invited, again, he'll have a shortcut in his web library. Just to show you here, I'm a sharee on a group as well, and now that I've synced my library, we see a shortcut to it. And as a sharee, you can click on the shortcut. That'll take you right to your EndNote online account where that shared group exists. If you want to share your entire library instead, you can go to the File menu and choose Share. Really the same process as what we just walked through for group sharing. You can see I already have some other sharees listed here. And again, with the newest version of EndNote 20, you can have up to 400 sharees. Once you've set up your sharing team, on the flip side, if you're a library sharee and you've received that sharing invitation email and you've accepted it, in EndNote, you can go to File, Open Shared Library. You would see your owner email address here. And I'm just a sharee on one library, but I could be a member of multiple sharing teams at once. I would just click on whatever library it is I want to interact with and choose Open. And we would see that come to the front of the screen. So this library that we're currently looking at, this is actually someone else's library that they've given me access to. And I have read-write access, so I can do almost anything that the sharer can do in this library. But just to show you here, just to close out our lesson, if I go ahead and now close our shared library so that we're back in our primary synced library. As I described, EndNote has an add-in for Microsoft Word, and when you install EndNote, EndNote will check for compatible versions of Microsoft Office. So long as the version is found, EndNote will load the Cite While You Write add-in. You'll have a new tab on the ribbon at the top of your document window. These are the Cite While You Write tools. There's one method of citation insertion where you would just position your cursor in Word and then use the little magnifying glass shortcut to be able to query any active library from your EndNote application. And EndNote will show you a list of matching references. There's a count of how many are there. If you have more than one library open, EndNote will look through each one for matching references. I've only got the one library open, so each one's from the sample library. But you can scroll through, you can look at all of the underlying information here. As soon as you're ready to choose one, you can just press Insert. Right where your cursor is flashing, you'll see the in-text citation. At the end of the text, you'll see the start of the bibliography. Right now, we're formatting with that default annotated style, but we can go ahead and click that drop down. We can choose another style, even a numbered style, let's say, and just apply that on the fly. There's one other citation insertion option called Insert Selected Citation that involves switching back to your library to select references to insert. So if you'd like to try this other option, you would still position your cursor where you want to add a citation. I've just moved it to the end of this sample paragraph. We go to press Go to EndNote. We're now back in our library. We can select it from under all references, or we can go to our project-specific group. We can highlight one or more references here. And whenever we're ready, we can click this shortcut to Insert Selected Citations. Right where our cursor is flashing, we see the group citation, and at the end of the document, we see the bibliography. If we want to customize a citation, like I mentioned, let's go back to an author date style. We don't want to make manual changes. You don't want to just manipulate what you see, because EndNote will revert a manual change if your document gets reformatted. If you want to customize a citation, you would highlight it with your mouse. You would select Edit and Manage Citations. On this window, the highlighted citation will be in focus. Here, you can do things like exclude author information. You can display it outside of the parenthetical citation. You can exclude the year. You can exclude both and just have cited page information, or maybe just a reference to a secondary work in your bibliography with no citation. But let's say we want to exclude the author. We want a plain text prefix of C also at the beginning of the citation, and we want a page range in the citation as well. Let's say we could type that all in here. If I type it in correctly, press OK. We see all of those changes take effect, and you can make those changes on a citation by citation basis, which is really handy. And the last thing I wanted to show, we're right at time, but the last thing I wanted to show, if the need arises, you cite something by mistake or the scope of your body of text changes as such, where you no longer need to cite a particular reference, you wouldn't want to just delete what you see. Again, that may cause trouble down the road. You would highlight the citation, and let's say it's the commonality reference in this group citation we want to remove. We highlight the entire group, go to edit and manage citations once more. That citation is in focus, but that group citation, we still need to select commonality since it's in the middle of the group. We can click the little drop down here, and on this menu, choose remove citation. It comes off that list. If we press OK, it comes out of the citation. And if we look, if that was the only time that reference was cited in our document, and we look at the bibliography, it would come out of the references as well. So that was a quick overview, really just scratching the surfaces of, EndNote's, essential capabilities. And I'm going to follow up with some direct support and training resource links, but I did just want to quickly show you here at EndNote.com. There's a training link at the top of the page. You can click there. That's where all of our instructional materials are found. We have pre-recorded training videos, a link to our e-learning platform, PDF guides you could print or read on screen. Our live training calendar, we host a wide range of sessions publicly for free on a monthly basis, so please feel free to sign up for those. I also host a weekly Q&A session, so if you run into an issue that's not time sensitive and you want to just save it for a Q&A session, please feel free to do so. It's always a lively conversation. But if you do run into a time sensitive question or issue, we have a great team of support reps that work around the clock 24/5 Monday through Friday. They're able to field questions via chat, email, and telephone. I did want to mention the chat support can come and go throughout the day depending on how heavy the call volume is, but as soon as someone becomes available once more for a chat, that button dynamically reappears on the page. With that said, I do want to thank you once more for joining me today. I hope you found this session to be beneficial, and I hope to see you in a future EndNote class or a future Q&A session.